Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and welcome back to Season 4 of Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy vs. Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. We kick off our fourth season with a special episode focused on a new book by acclaimed energy policy advisor Hal Harvey and award-winning New York Times reporter Justin Gillis. It's called The Big Fix: 7 Practical Steps to Save Our Planet, and it's out on bookshelves today. The Big Fix looks at 7 areas where communities, and individuals like you and me, can insert ourselves into key political decisions to ensure that we have the most climate-conscious choices being made. In the interest of squeezing both Hal and Justin into the show, Sarah, David, and I took a divide-and-conquer approach. First, you'll hear Sarah's and my chat with Hal about the arguments made in The Big Fix. After that, you'll hear from David and Justin, who spent the last year as colleagues at Harvard University. They dive into the concept of technology learning curves. We had fun trying out a bit of a different format, and we hope you enjoy it too. Whether bouquets or brickbats, we always love your feedback. So please shoot us a note to info@energyversusclimate.com. Now here's the show. Hal Harvey, welcome to Energy vs. Climate.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation.
So the format for our conversation, it's a bit different for our listeners compared to what we're normally doing, because we're taking a divide and conquer approach. So David had a chat already with your co-author, Justin Gillis. And now Sarah and I are talking to you. And the format for our conversation, Sarah, was between the two of us, we'll tease out some of the details about the book. And then Sarah and I will just get into a back and forth conversation around some of the more specific points and assumptions that you make in it. But off the top, I think we both agree it's a terrific book. And congratulations to you and Justin.
Well, thank you. It was a great partnership working with Justin. He's an extraordinary reporter, worked with New York Times and other papers, and he knows how to illustrate points with really deep reporting, really serious stories. So appreciate your kind words.
No, it's a great piece. And so let's actually start with a little bit about your background, and then maybe a line or two about the background of Justin, your co-author, and then tell us why the two of you, from different backgrounds, different walks of life, why did you come together to write The Big Fix?
Well, so I'm an engineer by training. And the reason I studied engineering is because I like fixing things. I was an auto mechanic and a carpenter. I made my own electric car and drove it for 5 years, built solar homes. And as I did all these things which are mechanical, I came to realize that the principal obstacles to a clean energy future are not the technologies, but the policy. So this is many years ago. That led me to help build a series of organizations to work on energy and climate policy, starting with the Energy Foundation more than 30 years ago, and then going on to the Energy Foundation China, the European Climate Foundation, the Indian Sustainable Energy Foundation, ClimateWorks, and a couple others. And they all have the same method, I suppose you'd say, which is you have to go after the big carbon emissions, and you have to do it with really sophisticated research and science behind your work, economics, technology understanding. But you have to win these policy decisions. There's no other way to land on a reasonable climate future. As long as the sky is an open, free sewer, we're not going to solve climate change. So until we begin to govern what we put into the sky, one way or the other, we're in for major hurt. It's happening right now. So that was the motivation, and that's been a sort of a snapshot of the work I have done in this realm.
Great, and we look forward to teasing out more. This notion that you introduced of the green citizen versus the green consumer, and how active citizens and their communities can really drive that change. But before we dive into some of those more specific points, can you discuss briefly what is the Big Fix, and perhaps for our listeners, what are kind of the major areas? You talk about 7 areas in the book where you want individuals and communities to really focus their efforts. So what are they? and why those 7?
The great word here is focus. There's a lot of efforts on climate change that, even if they succeed, would not make a difference. And the essence of strategy is to make some big choices and put your weight behind them. And that's what citizens have to do if they want to avoid the worst aspects of climate change. And that begins by understanding who makes the decision, which decisions are important and who makes those decisions. So one of our chapters is on the future of the electric utilities. Every month, everybody writes a check for maybe $100, $150, $200 to their local utility to pay for their electricity. Does that money land on clean choices or dirty choices? And who decides? And it turns out that because it's a regulated monopoly, the decision maker is the Public Utilities Commission. And then you dig into that decision-making venue, and the change strategy begins to reveal itself. Because Public Utilities Commissions, first of all, they're supposed to serve the public. They're open to the public for comment. They have rules, they have dockets, they have proceedings. It doesn't take an enormous amount of work. It's not zero work, but it doesn't take an enormous amount of work to begin to figure out where you can make an intervention as a green citizen. And since they decide whether your money lands on clean energy or dirty energy choices, it's worth speaking up. This is not write your congressman or write your senator. This is about understanding who the decision maker is and getting in there. So with the book, we do that with 7 chapters for different aspects, different elements in the energy economy. For example, transportation, the switch to electric vehicles. And we not only identify what's important and spend some time on how the decisions are made, but through especially Justin's reporting, we get into stories. So people can get a texture. What was this, easy or hard? What arguments failed? Which ones succeeded? Who brings the unusual ideas or the unusual political coalition to these decisions? So we end up with chapters on the electric utilities. And that's really important because if you have a clean grid and you electrify other aspects like electric transportation, you get clean transportation. So a clean grid is an enabler of many, many other good things to come. Transportation, we push for electric vehicles. Buildings, push for heat pumps, super efficient buildings for all new construction, and then heat pumps, which can give you up to 4 units or so of energy service for every unit of energy. That's a pretty good ratio. It's almost like free money. We spend a fair amount of time on industrial processes, cement and steel, fertilizer, some of the hard to abate sectors, as they're called. We walk through, how do you live? How do we set up our cities and our city streets in ways that can make them more human-oriented and less car-oriented without depriving people of access, in fact, increasing access to the goods and services we need. That's one of my favorite chapters is the chapter on urban design and urban planning, and especially use of existing urban infrastructure like streets. I mean, just one little aside to illustrate. The pandemic made for outdoor sidewalk cafes all over the world. I think there were more than 2,000 of them opened up in New York City. So we took away 2 parking spaces to create a whole new restaurant. That's a pretty good deal. And it enlivened the streets. It's this resource that's been sitting in front of us untapped. Just to finish the list, we spent a fair amount of time on research and development because we're not pretending every solution has been had. We need more R&D. But the overall message in each case, as we walk through the book, is that there are clear intervention points, clear ways to make a difference for individual citizens to get at the systemic changes that we need.
Sure. And I wanted, so you've got a great story about a couple communities, or sorry, citizens in 2 low-income and primarily Hispanic neighborhoods in Chicago, successfully using some pretty hard-hitting activist tactics to shut down a pair of coal-fired power plants that were creating health challenges in those communities. And Sarah and I have experience with lobbying to close down coal plants here in Alberta, but probably not to that degree, that on-the-ground work. But it's clearly not enough. So is your primary thesis, we just need to level up those kinds of actions? Because you've got some very encouraging stories in the book. Or do we actually need to fundamentally change the approaches that we're taking to drive bigger change? Or is it a combination of the two?
It's a great question. And I think it's a combination of the two. I mean, there have been some enormous successes. Coal use in America is down by about 2/3. And this recently signed Inflation Control Act is going to probably finish off most coal in America. It's not enough to just say no. You have to have obviously substitutes, keep the lights on. Renewable energy is on a spectacular growth curve right now. I'm still nervous. This is a significant, a huge improvement compared to a decade ago. It's still not enough. And it's easy for status quo actors to slow down change. It's also easy to have the wrong kind of change, to focus on the wrong things and to lock in a bunch of crappy investments. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but the field has never been as fruitful as it is right now.
I think that's really interesting, this idea of, what has worked somewhere that can be kind of copied elsewhere. I think for me, a lot of the work that I've done to try to advance solutions and reduce emissions over the past 10 years, I think I fully admit is not necessarily coming up with brilliant new ideas of how to do things, but actually just seeing things working in some place and trying to copy them here. And I think the extent to which that can be done is really, huge. I think we're at this moment where there's a lot of, first examples of things working, and now you can kind of copy and paste them in a lot of places. But I'm interested in how do you think about where that works and where that doesn't, right? And so, as a Canadian, of course, one of the things that jumped out at me reading in the introduction is where you talk about the idea that that carbon taxes are not a feasible or, not a practical solution, in that obviously, as you say, 30 years of effort to pass even these modest emission taxes have yielded nothing in Washington. Of course, sitting in Canada, we have this very different situation where we do have a carbon price, and, fair enough, that price has been, for a lot of its existence, has been quite modest. But I think we are really now coming to the point where it's starting to have more teeth as far as its magnitude. And so I'm curious about your thoughts. I mean, I think we can discuss a bit, but, how is it that some of these solutions that seem so seem so impossible in some places seem to work in others, and how do we take those learnings and try to figure out whether you're in one situation or another?
It's a great question, Sarah, and it's one that I spent a fair amount of time worrying over. I mean, I'm actually headed to Norway. This is a land of rational people with immense resources. Their electricity is 98% renewable. Well, they have this vast hydro bank, works on, but as a general rule, they've been very progressive on clean energy issues, and it has not been an especially partisan conversation. The Canadian story is actually fascinating. One of the interesting things about the Canadian story from my perspective, and I'd love your thoughts, the federal government required the provinces to either have a carbon price or a carbon cap, but they had the landing. And that's an interesting way to make decisions. Let people choose the method they want as long as they arrive at the ultimate goal.
With the big caveat that the federal government said, if you don't regulate emissions through some sort of carbon pricing system, we will step in and we will do that for you. And that has created years of wrangling and court cases and never-ending constitutional discussion over who has jurisdiction over what. When you've got provinces have jurisdiction over resources, like the one in which Sarah and I sit right now in Alberta, but you've got a federal government entering into international obligations on climate, and at a nation, at an international level, responsible and accountable for those obligations that they can meet without the help.
So it gets complex probably anywhere and under any circumstance. I guess the generic answer to your question, Sarah, which is a great one, is right. I mean, in America, we like to give away cash, and we like to hide the fact that we're giving it away by doing it with credits. So often sort of super complex ways of making those carrots work. There's a lot of restrictions in the renewable energy funding in this new climate bill that President Biden passed. It'll take some maneuvering, and there will be some important opportunities that we do not. I guess at the end of the day, though, I'm a strong believer in public policy. We have standards on you can't sell poisoned meat. You can't sell rotting food. There are safety standards for cars. There are safety standards and earthquake standard buildings. I think at the end of the day, we need standards for carbon dioxide. And I know that's not always popular with the Chicago school. Carbon price solves every cloud. So it has theoretical problems, but it has practical solutions, and that's a fair trade-off.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the other piece around sort of the solutions, and maybe they are complementary, but a lot of, I think, what you talk about in your book, I think of as sort of bottoms up, or, kind of what cities and these very local municipalities, how citizens can have influence there, or even, not necessarily local, whether it's like the Public Utility Commission, or, in Alberta, obviously we don't have a regulated utility, but there are still all kind of laws that get put in place that, constrain or direct where investment happens. And the ability for citizens to have more influence there. I think that's something that is maybe hard for, the average person that wants to be working on climate to get involved in, because they don't necessarily know where to go. These are, quite the maze of these different organizations. And so, how practically, or where practically, can people go to sort of find out more about what kind of levers to pull there, or even how do you find the right, person or the right institution to go to?
Well, that's also a great question. So first of all, we always try to apply two criteria to suggestions. One is that the decision-making was accessible to average citizens, but the other is that the decisions have scale. So it's not just putting out more recycling bins on the street. It's changing public policy. One of the things that has always surprised me and heartened me about changing public policy is that when you get, for these semi-obscure forums, 24 people or 50 people in a hearing, you can tip the hearing. So look at a Public Utilities Commission for a minute. Pipes and wires are monopolies. 40% of carbon goes through those monopoly pipes and wires. That means Public Utilities Commission is responsible for 40%, roughly, of the carbon in the atmosphere, and they have regulatory authority over that. When you have a public hearing, if you bring in a whip-smart utility lawyer, you might make a difference with great arguments. You might bring in a constituency, let's say a local environmental group that has thousands of members. That might influence an article. You might bring in 10 doctors of asthmatic kids. You might bring in 20 or 50 asthmatic kids to that hearing and say, are you really okay with my trouble to breathe because of your decisions? They say that every good argument has ethos, logos, and pathos. And I would add kairos to that. So ethos, who's speaking and what credibility do they have? A mom with an asthmatic kid has a kind of credibility that's, you have to be affected by it if you're a human being. Pathos, the story, the emotion that you get when you hire thousands and thousands of new people to put solar on rooftops. Logos, the logical argument that you should not destroy the atmosphere, that the costs of climate change far exceed the costs of avoiding climate change. And kairos, which is timing. You have to understand when, where, why, and how decisions are being made. Once you understand those things, you can pick your approach, and they're going to be different approaches for different people because of their skills, because of their interests. Maybe a contractor really wants to get involved with building codes. Maybe a restaurateur wants to help rethink how we use our streets. But the point is, if you align your forces around these key decisions, many of which are in obscure forms, you can make an amazing difference. And we've seen it again and again.
Yeah, and I think of how your work in China with the Energy Foundation, to your earlier point around a parent and wanting to protect a child from asthma, I think you cannot overstate the importance or the connection of the one-child policy to what China has done to phase out some of its worst coal-fired electricity. Because if you tell people you can only have one child, you really care whether that child is sick from respiratory illness, and you get very upset about that. But I want to come back to, again, sort of the thesis of the book, and actually something that Justin told David. And he said, people's votes matter. And how importantly we treat climate as an issue matters, how intelligently governments deal with climate as an issue really matters, and therefore voting matters. And I think we would all agree with that. But to one of the points you made earlier, and bipartisan in the case of the United States, or multi-partisan in the case of Canada, support matters. And that's proving to be elusive. We could have a wholesale shift in government by 2024 or 2025 that would take Canada in a very different direction policy-wise. So if that multi-partisan support in our case remains elusive, how do we true up those voting cycles that operate on 4 years with capital allocation timelines which operate on like 25 to 50 years for industrial decarbonization? And I say that because here again in Canada, people voted multiple times now for a very progressive government on climate that still has 3 years left on the clock and has sort of thrown a whole bunch of things at the problem. But companies I know, in spite of all those carrots and sticks, are still holding back, big companies, holding back capital on industrial decarbonization because of policy uncertainty post-2025, because we don't have that multi-partisan support. So voting matters, but to play devil's advocate, maybe what really matters is corporate courage, doing something in spite of that policy uncertainty. Or getting, I hate to say it, to really be devil's advocate, getting rid of voting entirely. And maybe China's autocratic approach is the way to really get at these long-term problems.
So sign me up as pro-democracy as we go through this conversation.
Yeah, I'd be devil's advocate. I'm not anointing myself autocrat for life yet. Yeah.
So I like to think of let's call it the Jerry Brown story, because this gives an example that we could pay attention to. He used to be the youngest governor in California's history. And when he was that, he passed a law called Title 24. It was a building code. And Title 24 is kind of the exemplar of really brilliant policy. So what Title 24 is, required buildings to be more energy efficient. But every 3 years, they incremented in their stringency, the building codes. Every 3 years got stronger. And they based it on a technical committee that decided if basically anything that paid for itself within 7 years of energy savings would roll into the code. It had 16 different climate zones. It was a very sophisticated policy. Two things happened. One is the manufacturers realized that they had to be in the top nth percent in order to sell their goods, right? Because if this standard gets tighter every 3 years and they're in the bottom of the heap, they're going to be literally out of business. So it became a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom. The other thing that happened is a whole army of carpenters, insulators, HVAC contractors, consultants became employed. We've got these new jobs. And so there became both on the industrial side and on the installation side, this incredible impetus to do better. So it created a kind of regulatory certainty that ended up as a virtuous cycle. So now, well, since Jerry Brown was the youngest governor in California's history, we've had Republican governors and Democratic governors, but the building code got tighter and tighter and tighter no matter who was in charge. It was pretty brilliant use of political bandwidth once, result perennially. But it was also pretty brilliant because it created what I call a virtuous cycle, which is the more you run this machine, the better it gets. And now the constituency for super efficient buildings in California is untouchable. It transcends political parties. I think we need to start thinking in policy design terms as well as policy aims.
And I mean, maybe it just shows that like I'm inherently a deep policy wonk, but like these stories of policies that are, create this race to the top, whether it's the California example that you shared or, the Japanese top runner energy efficiency equipment example, they're so sort of, I don't know, there's something about them that is so delightful in just how well they work. Another one that stands out for me there is the Norway, some of the early EV policy and the fact that EVs were exempted from taxes, wasn't necessarily a big policy decision. It wasn't this grand plan that they made. It was more almost this like little, loophole or thing that had been put in. And I can't even remember now where I heard this story. I'll have to go back to it for our show notes, but that, it involved the band, was it AHA, who was pushing for this. So many of these policies that somehow have led to be impactful. And I would actually even go back to what we were talking about with carbon pricing in Canada. And I think part of the reason that we were able to take a carbon pricing system and ratchet up the price is that actually it had been sort of put in place but by industry originally as more of a protection of keeping Ottawa out of Alberta's business, and then showing that we were going to regulate our own industry, and then arguably we didn't do it very much because the price remained low. But anyway, all of that is a long preamble to say there seem to be so many examples of these policies where, you sort of got something smart in the door early on, maybe before people even realized how important it was, and it grew over time to be very impactful. What do we do with that now? Now, when we think about trying to have new policies, one might argue, do we have time to plant these seeds and allow them to grow? Are there ways that we can still take that kind of approach and see results that, are happening on the timescale that we need? Or is it about looking for those examples that are there already we can use? Or how do we use that now, in 2022, 8 years away from less than 8 years from, everybody's 2030 targets?
So there are now more than 250,000 solar installers in the United States. These are people swinging hammers, climbing rooftops. Most of them, or maybe many of them, without a college degree. They're good. They're high-quality blue-collar jobs, which is exactly what the economy needs. There are windsmiths. I love the title. I love the name of people who fix windmills. We're about to enter an offshore wind boom, and that's going to employ a lot of the people who were previously on oil derricks. It already is in Europe, and it's going to start to in the United States. Builders initially used to think that lowest first cost was the only way to sell a building. Now performance matters. Performance is more and more visible as we get better sensing, better thermostats, and so forth. The electric car that you fill up for $4 instead of $100 makes a pretty nice near-term price signal, even if long-term the economics are still on the border. So I think we have in front of us and actually happening the beginnings of a series of virtuous cycles. Now, how we accelerate them gets back to public policy. So Governor Newsom, I'm landing on these California examples, you'll have to forgive me. Governor Newsom yesterday signed a paper that says no new internal combustion engines will be sold after 2035. That's a gutsy damn thing to do. And it's easy to make commitments that extend beyond your term in office. But the Air Board will start pushing interim targets along the way. So that's pretty interesting. In my opinion, and this is not hyperbole, I think we're actually at an inflection point with many of these technologies. Not all of them, but where the prices are down, where there's significant sectors in the economy that's profiting from building end units, whether it's wind turbines or electric vehicles or super efficient houses. And the more that machine runs, the more the new status quo is clean instead of dirty. So instead of fighting a rearguard battle all the time to clean up our air, to reduce pollution, to reduce carbon pollution, we're the new extant power. And it's happening. The Nordic countries did it before anybody. Surprise, surprise. California as a country did it pretty early. You've got British Columbia that's further down the path perhaps than Alberta. I'm not a Canadian, so I don't want to speak too much on this front, but it's underway. And what we really need to do is accelerate it. And that gets us right back to the public policy question.
Sure. And Hal, so you and Justin, you wrote this book, and long before, I think you started the book long before war in Ukraine broke out, or to be clear, Russia invaded Ukraine, which has turned the energy world upside down and created things like $5 gallon gasoline in the United States, and has really put energy security back to the fore of any kind of conversation around energy and climate. Are there any of the assumptions or any of the conclusions that you arrive at in the book, and this may be a big, fat, juicy softball, but that you think you would change or if you rethought in the context of this current climate now and this huge push for energy security, things like getting North American natural gas, as difficult as that may be, to Europe, the criticism around both Germany becoming so dependent on Russian natural gas and on renewables, and people are simultaneously making that criticism, and just where inflation is at in the United States. So what has changed post-Russian invasion of Ukraine?
The thing that's mostly changed is our awareness of some of the stupidities that have governed energy policy for years and years. the first thing I would have to say is every clean energy strategy, clean or dirty, has to prove that it's reliable and affordable, right? Can't just be clean and at an unattainable price or without producing 100% reliability. And so one thing that's changed is people are doing more and more what I would call systems thinking instead of device thinking. And that's really important. But it's worth taking a look back here for a minute. It's almost exactly 50 years since the first Arab oil embargo, which upended the power structures in the Mideast. When I turned 18, I had to go register for the draft. It was called selective service because Jimmy Carter, that environmentalist, left-wing Democratic president, had reinstated the draft, which we got rid of after the Vietnam War. And we had to do it because of the Middle East. Carter created something called the Rapid Deployment Force. And now I didn't have to go to join the military service, but I had to register for it. So that was a sobering moment. That was 50 years ago. And since then, we had another recession in the 70s. We had stagflation, which Gerald Ford tried to beat with these whip inflation now pins. Didn't work very well. We've spent trillions of dollars literally in the Middle East, and it's clearly because of our interest in oil. We've let the threats of climate change, which have been known for more than 30 years, pile up without, we're getting a pretty bad energy and security moment right now when the rivers in Europe are drying up, when China has the worst drought in human history, when Dallas gets 7 inches of rain in 24 hours. This is not energy security. None of this is energy security. We funded both sides of the war on terrorism, and we're funding both sides of the war in the Ukraine. It's insane. So energy security has waxed and waned in the public attention, but it's only grown in the real world. And now we're getting whacked again. All of which says you have to make some choices. And I would say the choice right now is if you care about energy security, you have to simultaneously care about climate change because they cannot be, you cannot solve one without the other. You will simply exacerbate the overall problem if you try to do that. Now, we're not buying. We need quick action on energy in Europe and on Southeast Asia and other countries. The U.S. and Canada are sort of uniquely privileged on this front, except we gave away price control without paying any attention to it. A word about that in a minute. So what I think the governments need to do is buy as much fossil energy as they can, but do it on short-term contracts and not build a ton of infrastructure that's going to take decades to pay back. So if you build a lot of LNG export terminals here and LNG import terminals in Europe, liquefied natural gas, those things have decade-long or 2-decade-long payback times. So I think governments are going to have to accept the risk of shutting them down, the financial risk. I think governments are going to have to bond them with contracts, say, you're going to build it, but we are going to shut it down in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years as soon as we can. And we're just going to have to bite the bullet for some stupid past mistakes. I would say also, the more important, flood the zone with renewable energy. Just put as much in as you can and use fossil for peaking. Use fossil for system stability. It's the number of hours the fossil runs that matters, not the capacity that you have. So let's overbuild on capacity by flooding the zone with renewables, and let's use fossils as a balancing force.
When you talk, so coming back, Hal, to the kind of systems question and back to the book, maybe as we sort of wrap up here, but I was struck by just how many people are in the acknowledgments of this book, many of whom I recognize from Twitter, and I think even some of whom have been guests on our show. And I think it really speaks to the complexity of the system and the fact that there are so many different things that need to happen. And I think what you've done really well here is, really boil it down to making that understandable and sort of laying out things that individuals can do. And I just wanted to highlight one part that I thought was really nice in terms of the way that you wrapped things up there around, this sort of tension between feeling like there's so much going on. And as individuals, there's so little that we can do. And your quote of Sammy Roth of the Los Angeles Times talking about, climate despair and stemming from the feeling of that there's nothing that he can do, but that the reality is that, he's only one person. There's only so much, he says, I can ask of myself. But just because I'm all powerful doesn't mean I'm powerless. And I think that's such a nice, for me, thing to take away from that message. And good reminder, I think, for anybody who's thinking about these issues on a daily basis, because it can at times be overwhelming. And so the ability to kind of be okay with being able to do what you can do as an individual, but realizing that that's not powerless, I think is a wonderful message. So I just wanted to highlight that, but I'll maybe turn things over to Ed to wrap us up.
Yeah, well said, Sarah. Thank you, Hal. We've enjoyed this conversation and approaching it a bit differently than we normally do at Energy versus Climate with the divide and conquer approach this time. Hal, you should know this is the first time where we've kind of done a book-focused episode in we've just started our fourth season of Energy versus Climate, but that really speaks to the quality of the book that you and Justin have co-authored. So thanks very much, and we're really grateful to have you on Energy versus Climate.
You were both exceedingly kind, and it's much appreciated, and I hope others find the book as compelling as it seems you have. So thanks for this chance to talk.
And now for David's conversation with Justin Gillis.
Justin Gillis, welcome to Energy versus Climate. Really great to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I guess it's been a while since we had pizza and some frou-frou joint in Cambridge, Mass. I'm really happy to have you. So the big fix. I have to admit that when I heard the title, I thought or feared that it would be another kind of how to save the world by turning off the lights and recycling and eating some kale chips. But I think you guys have written just a terrific book that really gets at the big picture questions sector by sector. I really salute you. And I feel like the book says a bunch of the key things that needs to be said. I think one of the beautiful things that struck me is that it said, we must arrive soon at a world where cleaning up is not something industrial corporations pledge to do out of good citizenship. It needs to become the law. It's filled with wisdom like that. So hats off to you for writing it. Welcome.
Well, thank you. And it's interesting you picked up on that, because the entire motivation for writing the book was, it would probably be true to say, was sort of our mutual annoyance, mine and Hal's, this idea that people can, by being green consumers, can sort of save the world. And, we're not opposed to being green consumers, right?
No.
Those things are all good to do. But we just need change on such a vastly larger scale than that, if we're waiting for kale chips to save the world, we're going to be waiting for a long time. And so, what we're arguing for in this book is for people to make the transition from being green consumers to being what we call green citizens. And that means making political demands that ultimately sort of pull these levers, these secret levers that we talk about in the book, and help us make change on a large scale. And not all those levers, I think it's very important for people to understand, are at the sort of national level. We really are trying to get across that a lot of bad decisions are being made right in your town, right in your neighborhood, in your state, and people's democratic voices can be used to counter that and try to steer us in a better direction. So that is the uber theme of the book, I would say.
Yeah, and I think one thing this book did really well structurally that I haven't seen before, and let's admit it, there's a plethora of climate books, is have sector by sector give people some background to what the sector is like, what drives its emissions, how to decarbonize, and then have this section, the pull the lever or whatever you call it section at the end of each chapter that gives people a sense of how they can lobby for something to happen. I think that really that's the connection that's crucial, because it's not eating kale chips. It is voting, but it's voting or other political action to some specific end. And I think you've done a good job of connecting those up.
That is exactly right. And, you probably picked up in the book that we eschew the idea of sort of that there's any simple answer here. For example, we don't agree that, a carbon price is some kind of simple answer, even though every economist in the world would tell you that's the main thing we ought to do. It's just been politically very difficult to get that passed, and impossible to get it passed at a level that would really do the job we need to get done. So we intended this to be a pragmatic book. Where are the levers as they really exist here in the real world? and how can we go pull them? That's really the focus.
Well, nice that you brought up the carbon tax, because that connects to learning, which is a place where I do want to push you a little bit. But just first of all,
Sure.
to completely agree with you, I think economists are correct that the most efficient thing is a slowly rising carbon tax that taxes all sectors equally. They're correct about that in a world where there is no technological change, where there's zero induced technological change, where all factor prices just stay the same. And so you just start at the cheapest things and work your way up. That is there. You can prove that they're correct mathematically in that world. The only problem is that is very clearly not the world we live in. And it's actually amazing how few economists will just frankly admit that assuming there is induced technological change, then it might make sense to have higher prices in some sectors to induce that change. And in that world, it's by no means clear that a carbon price is right. It certainly isn't mathematically clear that it's the cheapest thing, let alone the issues of its political challenges. So agreed on that. I think if there's a place where I felt both that it was, you said a bunch of the right things, and I love the fact that you went back to some of the early learning curve literature and explaining it to the public. I felt you were a little overconfident about learning curves. And I think there's a really interesting core there I want to hear your thoughts on. So, for example, you say in the learning curve section, quote, "The cost declines in these industries were entirely predictable. Indeed, they were predicted in some cases decades ago." Unquote. I think my read of the learning curve literature, and I got introduced to this in the early 90s by my mentor Hadid Al-Labadi, is that it's really a mess. It mixes up economies of scale and learning. And there are some things like solar that have these beautiful power law learning curves, but there are other important technologies, hydro, gas turbines, biofuels that really do not. And I don't think it's obvious in advance which ones do and which ones don't. So tell me a little bit, first of all, about learning curves. Teach the audience about that, and then tell me how are you really as confident as you said you were in that quote?
Let me start by saying I agree with everything you just said, and I actually think we say it all in the book. It's probably true that we kind of split this discussion into two places, and we discuss some of the limitations of the learning curve idea in the chapter that we call Inventing Tomorrow, which is about what does our strategy need to be. It's a long way from being a perfect framework, and let's just sort of define for the audience what the heck we're talking about here. Yeah. And I'll sort of go back to the beginning and sort of walk people through it. In the 1920s, a fellow named Theodore Wright, who was one of the early geniuses of American aviation, and worked for a company called the Curtiss-Wright Airplane Corporation that was selling a lot of planes to the government. And Mr. Wright, he noticed that the costs were falling as the airplane production scaled up. And he spent a lot of time noodling this and trying to figure it out. And he eventually, on a sheet of graph paper, sort of got his answer. And what he noticed was that every time the total production for all time of a particular model of airplane doubled, the cost fell by a certain percentage, which, if I'm recalling correctly, was about 19%, something like that.
Yep.
And decades of, so this idea is now called Wright's Law, and there's been sort of decades of work and development on this notion that when you plot the figures out on a chart, you get this slope that sort of tells you how fast the costs are falling. And that slope is called the learning rate or the learning curve for a particular technology. So it's now been observed in a whole bunch of different industries that as things scale up, you often get, particularly in products that are manufactured in factories. So that's sort of crucial, right? Like this seems to apply less to these big bespoke projects like nuclear power stations or something like that. But in products that are manufactured in factories, you sort of get this decline through time. And we've all experienced this. I mean, I remember lusting after flat panel televisions when they came out, in the 1990s. And in fact, when I bought my first one, it was the mid 90s, and I think I paid $5,000, right?
Man, they were paying you too much as a journalist.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. This was using your house as an ATM sort of back in the day.
I'm
so
razzing you.
so of course, now you can go buy one for, $500 at Best Buy, right? Or your favorite electronics store. So, there's a technology that marched down the learning curve, which of course is not what happens. It's not what happens with the price of milk or, the price of hamburgers. It's not what we're used to in our economic lives, but we have all experience, with cell phones, same thing. They got cheaper, they got more ubiquitous. I want to adopt though all the
let me stop you right there, because I think that's the key, is that when you actually go look at the data, I remember I really got this experience early on at Carnegie Mellon. Everybody thinks about this power law learning curve, which you well explained. So power law learning curve is when you double cumulative production, there's a fixed percentage, like say 20% for solar, decrease in cost, which is awesome. But it's true until it isn't true. And when you look at different technologies, it's true for a while and then it stops. And some technologies, the quality of the fit, the explanatory power of the fit isn't really better if you plot it versus time or versus that cumulative. So it's not clear how much you predict. And let me just push back on milk. You say, oh, we don't see it's true for milk. That's because you're living now. We had a ridiculous decline in the cost of milk through all this agricultural technology improvement. It just happened mostly before you remember. And now it's flat. And in fact, if you look at a long time for learning curves, and you can see that from some of the beautiful early learning curves papers from IASA, they tend to go with one slope for a while and then they stop. And we're not very good at predicting when they stop. And the only reason you think there's not a learning curve for milk is you have to be looking at a time when it's not going fast.
Agree with every bit of that, actually. I mean, and to some extent, you're a bit of an expert in this subject. We have become experts, involuntarily. You're pressing at the edges of, what is one able to sort of fit into a book chapter and how much nuance. I mean, there are entire books on learning curves and a vast literature on the problems with learning curves and so forth. So I'll agree with everything you said. We are not arguing that this is a perfect tool. What we are saying, and indeed we suggest a strategy in the book designed to essentially incorporate or take in the idea that this is not a perfect tool. We're saying it's a tool. And what the public needs to understand about this, let's switch gears slightly. We just passed a huge new climate law in the United States that's going to subsidize a whole bunch of technologies for the next 10 years. A lot of people of a libertarian stripe, many of my friends, are like a little annoyed about that. Like subsidies. Why do we need the subsidies? If you understand the learning curve idea, you begin to understand that the subsidies are a means to an end. We are trying to scale technologies that are right now really costly, electric cars, for example, because they're sort of stuck up there at the beginning of the learning curve, the high end of the learning curve. The assumption implicit in that bill that Congress just passed is we will buy down the cost of those technologies. So the strategy is to make them competitive with the dirty energy economy, right? And it is absolutely true that with some technologies, it is not going to work. I mean, it hasn't worked with nuclear power. You and I could probably come up with a bunch of examples of things where the learning curve never kicked in at all, or at some point, the tech seemed to kind of jump off the learning curve. And, nuclear power appeared to be on it for a while, then got off. We're saying the strategy is, as a government, as a body politic, pay attention, try it, see if we can kick these things onto the learning curve. If you do get, as we did in the case of solar power, this nice, clean power law learning curve, then you know where you're going. Then it's true to say, if we spend more, if we scale up faster, we're going to buy down the cost more. And by the way, now it's affordable in India and it's affordable in Indonesia. If we don't get a learning curve after the first, billion or $5 billion, we need to be willing to cut our losses and say, let's go on to the next technology.
To be clear, I don't mean to be beating you up too much on this. It's a deep problem. And let me take this from a more theoretical learning curve debate to a kind of practical problem. I think the challenge is, we know that solar, for example, has been incredible. It's, to me, by far the most important thing that's happened in the energy world in my whole lifetime, the learning curve for solar. But the fact that it has been a power law perfectly doesn't mean it'll keep going a power law. Again, gas turbines, another hugely important energy technology, were on one power law, then they kind of flattened out. So let's get this really practical, because I think the issue is about these big policy choices. Of course, I completely agree with you guys, and you said it exactly right, that the reason to prime the pump, the reason your libertarian friends are a bit wrong, are this reason about learning curves, all agreed. The issue is about choices between different ways to get to the same end. So we've had on energy versus climate a bit of a debate. I'll sometimes characterize it maybe as Sarah versus David about how we're going to manage renewable intermittency. Is it going to be just batteries getting cheaper? Or is it going to be ultra long distance interconnects, in principle, even cables across the Pacific? And who's right? I tend to favor the long distance interconnects more. I'm a bit skeptical about batteries. Other people, like Sarah, I think are a bit more optimistic. I think the honest truth is we don't know. And I think that really is the key. We don't know how much batteries will follow a nice learning curve. If it really was true, if the god of learning curves came from us from the clouds and said batteries will keep going forever at a progress ratio of 25%, then Sarah would be 100% right. Don't bother with long distance transmission. Just keep spending money on batteries. But if it turns out that they flatten out more the way onshore wind turbines are, and the progress ratio gets to be 10% or less, then batteries might not really deal with seasonal storage, and we need to think about other things. And that matters to our policy choices. And so I guess I want to, I agree with so much in the book. I'm kind of pushing on what I think is one of the hardest things, which is how do we make those decisions? Because we can't, as a society, do everything.
Yeah. I mean, our take on this, I think, is that we need to run an economic competition to find the best ways of solving these problems. We don't know right now how to solve the problems of the 2040s, let's say, where, you have a massive amount of renewable energy and you've got a huge balancing problem that, needs to be taken care of. I mean, that balancing problem is not very big right now in most of the world. I mean, we're at sort of 10, 15% solar. In some countries, we're struggling to get to 5% worldwide, right? So it's just not overall a very big problem yet, but we will get there eventually. And so I think what Hal and I would say is we don't know the best ways to solve the problems. We need more horses in the race than we have right now. We don't have enough horses on the field, about to run the Kentucky Derby, and let's get some more of them out there. And so, we are all for pushing, the existing tech, in a way, with sort of solar and wind, these are affordable technologies right now where, the cost is no longer the issue. It's these sort of ancillary issues. And we think, the big issue is just can we, are we allowed to build enough of the stuff? Are we going to get such resistance on the land use that it essentially bogs down that big build out? But, absolutely we need, for instance, we make a big point in the book about the need to invest more heavily in deep geothermal. We think that's a potentially world-saving technology if it can get onto a learning curve, and if we can sort of buy the cost down from where it is now, which is, sort of 3 or 4 times. It's up there with nuclear right now in terms of the cost of power, right?
Yeah, so and with bigger environmental impacts, and the impacts are deep and kind of irresolvable because you're drilling a lot of holes in the ground with technology that you've already had 100 years on. So I think that's a key place is you don't expect learning a lot when you're mostly adapting an existing technology. So the reason solar learning works so well is it's really about manufacturing the surface of that cell. The reason wind turbines don't learn so much is a big chunk of the costs is the steel fabrication, the electrical hardware, and so on, which is part of a much bigger 100-year industry, which has already done its learning. I guess just to sort of close up, I think you guys have really done a terrific job, and I think a really unusual book. So I salute you in dealing with that. And the questions I'm asking are the hardest questions nobody knows the answer to. And I think maybe I'll leave you with the one question is, you talked about getting more horses in the Kentucky Derby, 100% agree, and really happy with government subsidies to do that. To me, the big challenge for democracies is to be a little blunt about the way we treat horses in derbies, not that I'm an animal rights lover, how we put down the horses that are really no good, and how we end the horses where there's a bit of crony capitalism that wants to keep them running beyond their time. Because we absolutely want government money to get some new horses on the field, but we need to weed out the weak ones. Any closing thoughts on that?
It's absolutely a problem. And I've tried to do some thinking about how do you marry that with democratic politics? And I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that. I mean, we need a government. We need laws that are written with this idea in mind that we're going to test things out. We're going to run an economic competition. And for the stuff that's not working, we are going to put a bullet in it and sort of move on. And you're right that we're not very good at that right now. I mean, it might be to our advantage that, sort of the longest possible funding cycle you can get for something in Washington is 10 years, right? Which just happened with the new climate law, right? So at the end of 10 years, they're going to have to reauthorize all that stuff or kill a lot of it. I mean, you have people running the energy department right now. Jigar Shah is in charge of a lot of the stuff we're talking about, pushing this money out the door. And I think he's going to be pretty picky, right? Some of this is just, the right people, the right personnel, the right government. So people's votes, I voted, the Biden people. It was clear to me, a couple of years ago, we're going to do a better job of this than the Trump people. And so that's who I voted for, because this is the number one issue that I care about. People's votes really matter. What government you put in matters. How intelligently they're talking about these problems, how well they understand these problems really matters. And so if people come out of this book doing nothing else except saying to themselves, I need to vote on climate as a top issue, or maybe as my number one issue, that's progress. That would be a huge gain from our standpoint.
Well, beautiful endpoint. Let's end it there. Thank you so much. And I think you folks have written a book that is an ideal book to help voters make an intelligent choice. Thanks a whole lot. Thanks for coming to Energy versus Climate.
Sure. Thank you. Let's just remind people, the title of the book is The Big Fix, 7 Practical Steps to Save Our Planet, and it goes on sale. Simon & Schuster is the publisher. It goes on sale September 20th, and I hope people will check it out.
I guess I just want my cut for having a new title, which is The Big Fix, 7 Ways to Save the Climate, none of which are kale chips.
That'll be in the paperback. How about that?
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojnicescu. Crystal Hickey and Christina Pearson provide webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen.